The lights of the televised town hall glared like stage spotlights on a political showdown that no one had seen coming. The stage was sleek, modern, a polished monument to media power, draped in red, white, and blue. Cameras hummed quietly in every corner, already live to millions across the nation. But this wasn't just another panel. It was a powder keg. At the center of the panel sat First Lady Jill Biden, elegant, composed, practiced. She wore her trademark empathy like a designer coat, warm, approachable, calculated. The audience, curated and college-educated, leaned in with admiration as she spoke about dignity, compassion, and restoring decency to the American conversation. And then she said it, the line that would ignite everything. I mean, we're not going back to the days of Sharpies on hurricane maps and Twitter tantrums. This isn't reality TV, it's reality. Laughter erupted. A jab, clean and rehearsed. Everyone in the studio chuckled, except one. Senator John Kennedy leaned forward, slowly. His southern drawl had been quiet until now. But his eyes, cold steel behind kind wrinkles, said something had snapped. The jab at Trump wasn't just political. To Kennedy, it was personal. Not because he defended every one of Trump's antics, but because he'd seen what media smugness did to half the country. And Jill, smiling as the audience laughed, was delivering that smugness with pearls on. He cleared his throat, microphone live. The laughter died faster than it had started. With all due respect, Dr. Biden, Kennedy began, his voice even but sharp as barbed wire, you mock the man, but you mock the millions who voted for him, too. Folks who weren't looking for a show, they were looking for someone who didn't look down on them while talking about unity. The room went still. Jill blinked. The host stammered. Kennedy didn't blink. Y'all came here to talk dignity, he added, but that don't come with a punchline. And just like that, the game had changed. The silence that followed Kennedy's words wasn't empty, it was electric. The audience, once riding the high of Jill's clever quip, now sat frozen, caught between their admiration for her polish and their shock at Kennedy's precision. The camera zoomed in reflexively, catching every twitch of Jill's lips, every inch of Kennedy's unflinching stare. Jill adjusted her posture, forcing a composed smile as the moderator tried to smooth things over. Let's keep this respectful, she said, nervously chuckling, we're here for a conversation, not a confrontation. But it was too late. Kennedy leaned back slowly, like a man who knew exactly what he'd just done. Respect starts with not insulting people you disagree with, he said. I reckon a lot of Americans are tired of being laughed at by folks who claim to want unity, right before they call you names with a grin. A soft murmur broke out in the crowd, some in agreement, some unsettled. Jill's face tightened. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the First Lady, beloved by moderates, a symbol of poise. She wasn't here to debate, she was here to charm. But Kennedy had flipped the script. He wasn't just defending Trump, he was defending a culture, a whole population that felt trampled under the boot of coastal elites. And now, Jill was no longer speaking to a friendly audience. She was on trial. You know, Senator, she finally replied, her tone carefully measured, I think the American people are smart enough to know the difference between a joke and disrespect. Kennedy didn't flinch. And I think they're smart enough to know when they're being condescended to. A beat. The moderator scrambled to pivot. Let's talk policy, education, economy, healthcare. But the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about pride, about class, about whose voice got to matter in America. And Kennedy, calm and deliberate, had just made sure his side wouldn't be laughed off the stage again. The moderator's voice quivered as she tried to guide the conversation toward safer ground. Dr. Biden, what would you say your husband's administration has done to heal the nation's divisions? It was a lifeline, a chance for Jill to recalibrate, to steer things back into familiar waters. She smiled, gracious but firm. We've worked to bring dignity back to the White House. Real leadership, real empathy, and not theater. Another strike. Subtle. But not subtle enough. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. Dignity, ma'am? His voice stayed soft, but the heat behind it simmered. Was that before or after Callan parents who showed up at school board meetings, domestic terrorists? Before or after the DOJ got turned into your family's law firm? The audience murmured. A few gasps. This wasn't just a counterattack, this was war. Jill's composure cracked for the first time. Senator, I don't think it's appropriate to. Kennedy leaned forward. No ma'am, what's inappropriate is actin' like decency means agreein' with y'all. It's funny how quick unity turns into silence when folks push back. The moderator looked like she was holding her breath. Jill's aides, watching off stage, scrambled behind the scenes, whispering into earpieces, motioning for a reset. But Kennedy wasn't finished. My mama taught me not to laugh at people who were different. Y'all laugh at Trump for the way he talks, walks, tweets, fine. He's a big boy. But you laugh at the people who believed in him. Farmers, welders, truckers. People who don't get invited to fancy panels but still pay the taxes that keep y'all flying private. You could hear a pin drop. Jill bit her lip. For the first time in the broadcast, her elegance wasn't armor. It was glass. And Kennedy's words? Shrapnel. The moderator gulped and tapped her stack of cue cards like they might save her. Let's take a short break. But no one moved. The audience didn't clap. They didn't laugh. They just watched, transfixed. Because this wasn't a debate anymore. This was a reckoning. The stage lights dimmed slightly as the "break in progress" graphic flashed across the screen. But the silence backstage was louder than the applause had ever been. Staff buzzed in frantic whispers, camera operators froze in place, and Jill's expression hardened as she dabbed the corner of her mouth with a tissue, not from tears, but from tension. Senator Kennedy, meanwhile, sat unmoved, sipping from a plain white coffee mug. His body language was loose, almost relaxed, like a man waiting out a rainstorm on a porch he'd built himself. A producer leaned in toward Jill. We can pivot after the break. Talk about school funding, make it personal again. Steer it back. But Jill didn't respond. She stared at the stage floor, lips pursed. This wasn't supposed to be hard. She was a Biden. She'd survived decades in Washington, critics from every direction, but this? This was different, because Kennedy hadn't attacked her with sound bites. He hadn't rolled out statistics or party talking points. He'd told a story, a cultural one. One where she and her world were the punchline. Back on stage, a stage manager counted down with her fingers, 5, 4, 3, the lights surged back. The audience straightened in their seats. Jill plastered on her smile like a soldier strapping on armor. Welcome back, the moderator said brightly. Before the break, we were talking about. Kennedy cut in, calmly, not rudely, but with authority. I'd just like to say one thing, he said, glancing toward Jill. I don't think you're a bad person, Dr. Biden. But good people can still look down on others without realizing it. A pause. My folks don't need to be healed. They ain't sick, they're just sick of being mocked. And maybe, just maybe, they're tired of being told what's best for them by people who've never stood in their shoes. Jill's jaw tightened. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They listened. Eyes wide, hearts clenched. Because Kennedy wasn't throwing punches anymore. He was drawing a line. And everyone watching knew, this conversation wasn't going back to normal. The set glowed under flawless lighting, but the air had turned heavy, like a thunderstorm brewing just off camera. Jill Biden blinked slowly, hands folded neatly in her lap, the practiced elegance of a first lady holding strong, but faltering. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Across from her, Senator Kennedy's posture hadn't changed. He wasn't smug, wasn't showboating. He was simply settled, like a man who'd said what needed saying and had no regrets about the fallout. The moderator cleared her throat. Dr. Biden, would you like to respond? Jill inhaled sharply. Senator, she began, her voice measured, almost too calm, your words might resonate with some. But the truth is, leadership means guiding people forward. Not clinging to a version of the past where one man, Trump, divided this country with cruelty disguised as honesty. The crowd murmured. A few heads nodded. Others tilted in confusion. Something had shifted. Kennedy didn't flinch. Ma'am, he said, I was raised to believe honesty wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. And some folks'd rather hear a hard truth than a soft lie with a smile. A few people in the audience clapped. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Intentional. Jill kept her gaze fixed. Clarity, she repeated, lips tight. Is that what you call the tweets, the mockery, the chaos? Is that the version of America your voters long for? Kennedy didn't blink. No, ma'am, he said slowly. What they long for is not being laughed at on late-night shows. Not being called racist or backward 'cause they go to church or own a pickup. They long for leaders who don't think rural means ignorant, or Southern means stupid. Jill's reply caught in her throat. That silence? It spoke louder than any monologue ever could. And the audience heard it, loud and clear. Because for the first time, it wasn't about red versus blue. It was about who still felt seen. And who didn't. As the exchange intensified, the air in the studio had thickened to the point of suffocation. The moderator looked like she was grasping at the script with invisible hands, trying to rein things back into the realm of daytime television civility. But that ship had long sailed. This wasn't a talk anymore. It had morphed into something raw, unscripted, electric. Senator Kennedy leaned back in his chair, not out of arrogance, but with the comfort of a man who'd lived what he was saying. His voice, still steady, cut through the tension with the edge of lived experience. Dr. Biden, he said, you talk about unity. But I gotta ask, unity for who? The folks who live in flyover states? The ones who can't afford the fancy universities or the blue-check platforms? When they speak, they're called angry. When you speak, it's called leadership. The audience didn't react right away. But they heard it, in their bones. Jill's smile cracked ever so slightly. That's not fair, Senator. I've spent my life in classrooms, in communities. And yet, Kennedy cut in gently, you just mocked a man millions voted for as if they were brainwashed sheep. Maybe you didn't mean it that way. But that's how it sounds to the single mom in Shreveport, or the Vietnam vet in Mississippi, or the factory worker who's watched 3 plants close since 2019. A pause. He let it sit. Maybe we see Trump differently because we've lived different lives. But I'd never laugh at the people who believed in you. I'd fight for M, even if I disagreed with M. That's the job, isn't it? The audience erupted, not in partisan cheers, but in something else. Recognition. Catharsis. A man had finally said what so many had felt for years but didn't have a microphone to scream through. Jill's hands curled around her notes. This isn't about geography, Senator. It's about decency. He, Trump, stripped this country of empathy. Kennedy tilted his head. No, ma'am. Empathy left the building the day regular folks got told they were a basket of deplorables. Trump didn't teach them to fight back. He gave M permission to stop apologies and . And just like that, he wasn't defending Trump. He was defending the unheard, and the crowd knew it. The moderator tried to move things along. She gestured subtly to the control booth, maybe asking them to shorten the segment, maybe praying for a commercial break that never came. But the audience was glued. No one was reaching for their phones. No one was checking their watches. This wasn't just a debate anymore, this was a reckoning. Jill Biden sat with her chin raised high, still composed but blinking more than usual. The light from the studio lamps caught the gloss in her eyes, and for the first time, She looked less like a polished public figure and more like a woman caught off guard. Not by aggression, but by conviction. "Senator," she said, more sharply now, "you're making this personal. Turning disagreement into insult. This isn't what Americans need. They don't need more heat. They need light." Kennedy's reply came without hesitation. "Ma'am, if we'd had more light, maybe they wouldn't have spent the last few years in the dark." The crowd shifted audibly. Someone gasped. A couple people clapped, unsure if they should. Others held their breath. Kennedy turned toward the audience now, not just speaking to Jill, but to the people watching at home. The ones who'd tuned in expecting a soft feature on politics and personalities, but had stumbled into something closer to a courtroom testimony. He held up a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket, unfolding it slowly like a ritual. "This is a letter from a woman in West Virginia. Her son took his own life last year. Lost his job, lost his insurance, couldn't afford his insulin. You know what she wrote me?" He looked Jill directly in the eye. She said, "I didn't vote for Trump because he was kind. I voted for him because he was cruel to the people who ignored us." A few audience members wiped their eyes. The silence was crushing. "That's not an endorsement of cruelty," Kennedy added, softer now. "That's a scream for attention, for recognition, for help. And you know what hurts, Dr. Biden? That it took someone like Trump for her to feel seen." Jill swallowed hard. "Then what do you want me to say?" Kennedy didn't flinch. "Not much. Just, don't laugh at them next time. Don't mock their pain. They didn't go to Yale, but they matter." A silence thicker than any applause settled in the studio. Because now it wasn't just about politics. It was about dignity. And Jill knew she'd touched a nerve she hadn't expected to answer for. For a split second, the studio didn't feel like a studio anymore. No lights, no audience. Just two people, representing two Americas, staring across a chasm built on decades of resentment, misunderstanding, and wounded pride. Jill Biden sat silently now. The words wouldn't come. She was no stranger to media pressure, but this was different. Senator Kennedy hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't called names. But he'd done something far more dangerous. He'd told the truth, unpolished and without apology. The crowd, once leaning toward laughter, was now leaning toward something deeper, reflection. She straightened slightly in her chair. "Senator," she said, almost gently now, "you speak for a group of people who feel abandoned. I won't deny that. But don't you see? Trump took that pain and weaponized it. He turned your people's suffering into fuel for his ego." Kennedy's eyes didn't move. "Maybe," he said. "But you're missin' the point. Folks didn't follow him because he was noble. They followed him because he showed up. And that's more than most of this town ever did." The audience stirred again, less like a reaction, more like recognition. Like something that had been buried in the back of their minds had finally been spoken out loud. Kennedy leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice low but firm. "People didn't vote for a saint, Dr. Biden. They voted for a middle finger." And while all the TV anchors and polished politicians were wringing their hands, folks in Arkansas and Kentucky were thinking, "At least someone's finally saying what we've been screaming into the void." Jill's face tightened. "So you defend him? Everything he's done?" Kennedy shook his head. "No, ma'am. I don't defend sin. But I understand desperation. There's a difference." He turned to the audience again. "You want to stop the next Trump? Show up before someone like him has to. Listen before people scream. Care before it's too late." A long pause. Then, applause. Real. Hesitant at first, then growing. Not for politics. Not for sides. But for honesty. Even Jill, to her credit, nodded once, reluctantly, but respectfully. "That was well said," she admitted. Painfully so. Kennedy gave a half-smile. Truth usually is. The air inside the studio had shifted. Gone was the tension built on sarcasm and smugness. It had been replaced with something raw, an atmosphere thick with things left unsaid for too long. The moderator, uncertain now how to proceed, leaned slightly forward. Dr. Biden, Senator Kennedy, we've had a lot of emotion here tonight. But if we could wrap up with one final thought each, what do you believe America truly needs right now? Jill Biden breathed in deeply. Her poise returned, but it was tempered now, no longer shaped by media polish, but by the sting of unexpected humility. America needs compassion, she said slowly, choosing each word like a fragile ornament. It needs unity. And yes, that means disagreeing without destroying one another. She glanced toward Kennedy, not with contempt, but with caution. We need to lead with empathy. Kennedy sat still. His posture wasn't combative, but neither was it softened. He didn't shift in his seat. He didn't blink much. When he spoke, it was like opening a sealed vault of unspoken grievances, one brick at a time. Dr. Biden, empathy's a beautiful word. But it don't mean much to a man whose power got shut off last week because the cost of eggs tripled. The audience gave a scattered murmur. He continued. We talk about unity, but folks feel like they've been unified in one thing only, being ignored. By both parties. By this whole polished machine. He turned slightly, locking eyes with the cameras now, speaking not to the people in the studio, but to the ones behind the screen. The truckers. The single moms. The tired dads working 2 jobs. The kids growing up in forgotten zip codes. You can dress politics up in all the right words. Call it equity. Call it progress. But if it don't feed people, heal people, protect their freedom, and give them hope, they'll call it what it really is, useless. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even Jill nodded again, slowly. She knew the optics, the talking points, the hand signals from staff behind the scenes. But none of that could override what had just happened. Kennedy didn't just score a point, he opened a wound the nation had spent years pretending didn't exist. And there was no walking it back now. As the studio lights began to dim, and the moderator gave the usual, "Thank you for joining us," speech, neither Jill Biden nor John Kennedy moved right away. Something had shifted, not just in the studio, but in the conversation itself. This wasn't politics as performance anymore. The camera panned across the audience, faces marked not with applause-ready smiles but with something heavier, thoughtfulness. Reflection. Some even looked shaken, like they'd heard something they weren't ready for but needed anyway. Kennedy stood up first, slowly. He adjusted his jacket, gave a polite nod to the moderator, and turned toward Jill. She rose as well. Their eyes met, no warmth, but no venom either. "Senator," she said, her voice low but even, "I don't agree with a lot of what you said tonight." "I'd be surprised if you did," he replied. "But," she continued, "you spoke for people we don't hear from enough. I'll give you that." Kennedy didn't smile. He just looked her in the eye and said, "Then start listening to them before it's too late." Jill gave a small nod, then turned to exit the stage, heels clicking against polished hardwood. Kennedy followed after a moment, slower, deliberate. As the camera's red light faded, backstage buzz kicked in. Producers spoke into headsets. Technicians powered down consoles. But in the green room, no one was talking. They were watching. Watching a senator who didn't need a teleprompter to make his point. Watching a first lady who came expecting to win with wit, and left with weight on her shoulders. And somewhere, on couches across the country, Americans watched too. Some nodded. Some rolled their eyes. Some wept quietly, not even sure why. But none of them forgot. Because this wasn't just another viral moment. This was a mirror. And America had no choice but to look. And that, folks, is where it all ended, but not really. Because tonight wasn't just about a senator and a first lady clashing on a stage. It was about the deep divide running through the heart of America. The struggle between polished narratives and raw truth. Between rehearsed empathy and lived experience. Senator Kennedy didn't walk onto that stage looking for applause. And Jill Biden didn't show up expecting to be humbled. But that's exactly what happened. One spoke from headlines. The other spoke from the dirt under his constituents' fingernails. Maybe you agree with him. Maybe you don't. But you felt something, and that means the conversation isn't over. So ask yourself. In a world full of noise, who's really telling you the truth? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that pull back the curtain, and force us all to think a little harder. Thanks for watching, stay sharp. Stay free. And we'll see you in the next one.